Okay.
Sorry for speaking slightly late, Leader.
No, you're okay, Alan, that's fine. We were hanging on, just waiting to be quoted. We've got apologies from Councillor Bamforth and I'm assuming Councillor Cunningham. So we're all, the rest of us are all here. Moving on then, colleagues, first report we've covered, the report, apologies for absence. Any declarations of interest? No, thank you. In that case, can we then move on to item 3, the revenue budget monitoring outturn? And Margaret, I assume you're covering that.
Yes, the revenue report this time is covering the period up to the end of August. So we've looked at all the expenditure and income, and also had a forecast of the council tax collection that we're expecting. Overall, we are forecasting a year-end overspend of £175,000, or just 0.1% of annual budget, and that's for all the general fund services. But if you look at the reasons for that, the departmental variance reasons are all set out in the report as usual. But really behind that, the position reflects 1.46 million of COVID pressures, offset by 1.29 million of operational council underspends. And as you know, all of the pandemic pressures that we're currently forecasting can be covered by the COVID grant funding that the council's received to date. So if we adjust for that, the net forecast underspend is 1.29 million, or 0.5%. If that underspend is maintained to the end of the year, that would obviously help the council meeting the future budget challenges that we've got coming ahead. But of course, as I always say, it could be subject to quite significant change. For example, you know, COVID's still with us, and if these pressures increase again, that'll have an impact. Or we haven't yet settled the current year pay award, and that could also have an impact on the outturn position for this year. So our finances are still tight, and we'll continue to monitor this for you and provide the regular reports with the outturn forecasts. So at the moment, I'll just ask you to approve the various budget adjustments that are shown in the report, note the financial position, and just ask that directors continue to do all we can to monitor and control expenditure in the current year.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Margaret. Yeah, I appreciate the amount of work that goes into this, the time margins that we have, and obviously the complexities of dealing with the current circumstances, which clearly can alter the various pressures almost on a weekly basis, certainly. So we understand all the difficulties within that. Does anyone have any comments that they wish to make at the moment?
Tony.
Danny, yep.
Margaret, see last year at this time, what was the overspend at the same stage last financial year?
I've not actually got that at my fingertips, but it was an awful lot more. Yeah, because obviously at that point we didn't know how much COVID grant support we were going to get. Yeah. So we were forecasting quite a large overspend. And as you know, towards the end of the year, we did receive a substantial amount of COVID funding, both for last year and to take us on into this year. And this is why we at least know that the forecast COVID pressures that we are aware of at present are going to be covered by what we've got in the bank, as you could say.
No, just for the budget strategy. Just for the budget strategy group coming up, basically with a lot of help than we were last year.
As far as the COVID pressures are concerned, yes, and right. Also we do have a bit of an underlying underspend this year because we're trying very hard to control the expenditure. So we hope that will last to the end of the year. But as I said, the pay award hasn't settled yet, and that could change things substantially. And also, we're finding that inflation's running higher this year than we'd forecast too. So that has brought some pressures too. But we just need to keep our eye on it.
Right, no bother.
Yeah, I think that the bottom line, Danny, and I appreciate the concerns, but I think we're all concerned. Yes, last year did look more bleak, but now that we've got some funding, we're slightly better. But it's really only managing to balance where we should be, if you like. There's not a huge amount there additional to play with, and we don't know as yet just where we will be over the course of the next few months, particularly coming into winter, when we know that there may well be additional pressures that come to the fore. Alan?
Yes, actually, I just really to echo your comments about the continuing serious situation we face, and there's a lot of dark clouds on the horizon. But I just wanted to echo your comments about the appreciation, I think, you expressed to the hard work of the staff, Margaret and her staff, to at least get us to a place where we know where we're heading and perhaps mitigate the situation we face. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Lafferty, much appreciated. And again, yeah, I'm sure the staff do appreciate. We know that how difficult the circumstances are just now in the context of how people are having to work, and with the changing nature of all of the, the impact of many aspects, not just the pandemic that we face. So yes, it is an ongoing challenge without any doubt. Okay, colleagues, on that note then, I'll be happy to note the recommendations that are included with the paper. Note our position as the forecast underlying general fund operational underspend is 1.289 million. But again, much of it is subject to potential change over the next few weeks and months. And Margaret has already outlined the pressures that are there accordingly. I'll be happy then to note all of the recommendations, colleagues. Thank you. Moving on to item 4 on the agenda, the Housing Services Annual Assurance Statement for 2020-21. And Phil, I assume you're covering this.
Yes, thank you, Tony. The purpose of this report is to seek approval for what's called the annual assurance statement for 2021. The report comes to Cabinet each year, but it still can be quite confusing, so I will take the members through it. The Scottish Social Housing Charter requires each landlord to provide the Scottish Housing Regulator with details of their performance against 37 different indicators. This is known as the Annual Return on the Charter, ARC, or ARC for short. Also, all of the social landlords need to provide an annual assurance statement which confirms compliance with the regulatory framework, the Scottish Social Housing Charter, and compliance with the legal obligations. In effect, it's like a self-declaration of good health, which then needs to be signed and returned to the Scottish Housing Regulator. Based upon the ARC submission and that annual assurance statement, the Scottish Housing Regulator will then produce a landlord report for each landlord and an engagement plan. So it is quite complicated with 4 component parts: the annual assurance statement, the annual return or the ARC, the landlord report, and the engagement plan. Looking at the report itself, which is contained as Appendix 1, it demonstrates that the housing service is performing well, both in comparison to last year and the average for the housing sector in Scotland. Just to touch upon some highlights, in relation to repairs, our repair service performance is excellent. In terms of emergency repairs, we have an average completion time of 2.4 hours compared with the Scottish Council average of 6.2 hours. Similarly, in relation to non-emergency repairs, we completed our repairs in an average of 5.3 days, as opposed to a Scottish Council average of 7.3 days. 99.5% of jobs are fixed first time compared to the Scottish Council average of 92%. I would, however, note that customer satisfaction for repairs, despite all of this, is lower than the Scottish average. And we believe the reason for this is customers don't feel that the housing services communicate effectively regarding their repairs. To address this, we have redesigned the staff structure, and we're also investing in new software, such as real-time handheld devices and the capacity which permits customers to self-serve. So, for example, we can direct message and we can text customers to advise them of when their repair will take place, and we can text them to remind them as well. From beginning to end, the implementation of that software will take about 3 years. It was scheduled to take 2 years, but because of COVID, it has been delayed. We do hope that the implementation of that software will improve that customer satisfaction issue. In relation to the Scottish Quality Housing Standard, we are at 91% compared to a Scottish average of 90.5%. And in terms of energy efficiency, we're at an average of 93% compared to a Scottish average of 86%. So we do have a number of substantial areas where our performance is above that of the Scottish average. I do wish to draw attention to a couple of areas where we are below the Scottish average. The first is in relation to rent arrears. We have experienced an increase in rent arrears during COVID, as has every single social landlord in the country. Again, we expect our new software system will help us, as it will permit automatic texting to remind tenants that they are in arrears. Also, a big driver in relation to rent arrears has been as tenants has moved from housing benefit onto universal credit. Another area of performance which has been below the Scottish average relates to voids, or what they call empty homes. Here our performance was 1.8% as opposed to an average of 1.4%, and the lower the figure the better. So in that regard, we were worse than the average in Scotland. Again, our current software system is a major disadvantage as it doesn't have an empty homes module. So currently we need to use a paper-based system, and that's been especially difficult during the lockdown period. I am, however, pleased to advise that in the second quarter of this year, our void rent loss is down to 1.13%. So it is now better than the Scottish average. And if we continue that performance, we'll be able to tell a different story next year. A final area where I would note we are below the Scottish average relates to tenancy refusal rates. When finding permanent accommodation for homeless households, we try always to meet the needs of the household in terms of their preferred location. Unfortunately, we aren't always able to do that. We will permit the family or a household to restrict their bid to an area of their choice for a 3-month period. However, if stock doesn't become available, we then need to offer them something often out with the area of their choice. A difficulty we have is that 50% of our stock is in the Barhead area, 65% of it is in the Leven Valley area, and yet most of our council's population live in the Eastwood area. So this does result in a high number of refusals because we aren't always able to offer people homes in the areas of their choice. So to conclude, I think the service has done well this year, especially given the restrictions placed upon us in relation to COVID. We performed better than the Scottish average in a number of key indicators, and in the indicators where we don't perform above the average, hopefully I've given the context, and especially in relation to empty homes, that issue should be addressed for this time next year. On that basis, I'm pleased to advise this report to Cabinet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Much appreciated. It is a comprehensive report. Obviously, a lot of the information there is vitally important to us, and it's good to know that our systems are improving and that we'll be tackling the areas where we appear to be below the Scottish average. But some of that, as you've just highlighted, can be quite easily explained, and the reasons for it. Things like rent arrears, etc. We know it's a problem. We know that moving on to universal credit and indeed the pandemic have been two areas which have been a cause for concern. Moving on to universal credit, I know automatically puts people into arrears to some extent, probably around about 5 weeks. So that in itself highlights some of the problems that we face. But I think that said, there are, as you've highlighted, a number of very good positives within the report, and that's great to note. And I'm sure that we're all happy to see how much the service is improving on the whole, despite many of the difficulties that we've faced over the last year and a half. Happy to open it up, colleagues, for any comments.
Tony,
Danny.
thanks. Just a question there in arrears. I mean, this has always been my bonnet about, you know, people that's on benefits, you know, when they take up a new tenancy, you know, I think it's about 50% of them end up in arrears before they even, you know, have the keys for the house. This seems to happen every year. And, you know, it's just hit the nail on the head there, the universal credit. I mean, basically, these tenants are, you know, they've got a minimum of 5 weeks rent arrears. How can that happen? Phil?
Well, unfortunately, that's the way the universal credit system has been set up, in that I think there's an assumption that tenants, even if they're on benefit, perhaps have the means to pay the rent up front and they'll be paid in arrears by the universal credit system. In practice, many incoming tenants don't have that money up front. So consequently, often as a result of no fault of their own, our tenants find themselves a number of weeks in arrears from day one. It's down to the way the universal credit system is set up, as opposed to a failure on behalf of our tenants, I believe.
I mean, we're talking about, you know, £500-600 here, you know, in arrears before they even. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, it is a difficult situation, and most social landlords did report their concerns before the universal credit system was introduced. So unfortunately, at the moment, it's one of those situations that we need to accept and manage, and we therefore need to try and prevent rent arrears from other reasons getting any higher in order to ensure it can be managed as much as possible.
How do we need to accept that, Phil? I mean, surely that's wrong from the start to place somebody in arrears.
So it's a UK government policy. It isn't something the housing service.
We don't have control over it, Danny. Yeah.
Sorry?
I said we don't have control over it, Danny.
No, I understand that, but surely there's got to be a wee bit of lobbying from, you know, the political groups in regards to this.
I think you'll find, Danny, that in general there's a lot of lobbying was done at the time in terms of universal credit, and many of the issues that are now a concern were highlighted by probably all parties to some extent at the time. But unfortunately, the system has been introduced, and it's what we have to work with at the present.
No, I understand. That's a piece of nonsense.
Any other comments, colleagues? Councillor Lafferty, you went in.
Yes, thank you, Leader. It's very nice to see you again, Phil. It's been a long time since we've been working together. It was just in regards to the customer services in housing and the way and the Environment Department in general, and how they. I must say, I found them very responsive anytime I have issues with housing, rather than the old way of trying to phone someone up or going through the members portal to go through the scheme you're involved in setting up, Phil, of responding to constituencies' problems. Just surprised that despite that, the figures seem to suggest that it was not quite as rosy as I was thinking. And secondly, I was just going to ask about the eviction policy, because I know some years ago we took a more vigorous response to folk that weren't paying their rent. But I was just saying, I can appreciate what Councillor Devlin, the point he's making, that these are very hard times. It's perhaps times where we have to be more accommodating of our constituents. Thank you.
Okay,
do you want to come in on that, Bill? Or
yes, just to comment on the repairs issue. I think the problem is just the sheer volume. We do something like 10,000 response repairs a year. And at the moment, the system doesn't give the capacity, for example, for the customer to go online and to track the progress of their repair. So they need to call in. If the repair for any reason is delayed due to a problem with materials, we need to telephone the tenant. If we telephone the tenant and they aren't in, they need to call us back. So it's not necessarily as smooth a process as we would like. Our current software system doesn't permit direct texting from the system, etc. Under the new system, if somebody logs a repair and they're given a date, that date can be texted to them. They can be sent a reminder 24 hours before the repair. If there's a delay due to a shortage of materials, we can automatically text them to advise them of that. So it will make the whole process a lot smoother. But in order to do that, we need to implement a new software system. So I can understand from the customer's perspective why there's an element of discontent, because people these days expect to be able to access services online and to receive text updates, etc. So I can understand why the customer says, look, we want this done a little differently, and that's why we put those plans in place. So hopefully that answers your questions, Councillor Lafferty.
Yeah, yes, that's very helpful. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Councillor Merrick.
Thanks, Leader, and thanks for the report, Phil. It is very comprehensive, and where there are points to address, you've got that in the improvement plan. That's wonderful, particularly around the empty lets and the rent collection, the arrears for rent. But the one point I wanted to ask about was the antisocial behaviour resolution. Okay, so that's sitting in amber, that's fine. But what does resolved mean for antisocial behaviour? It means that everybody's content or content enough, or the reason why I asked that question is that is one of the things that I keep getting are noisy neighbours or some other antisocial behaviour. So I just want to know what resolved means.
Okay, not all of the indicators in the charter are as precise as others. So, for example, rent arrears, it's a quantitative figure, it's a fairly precise figure. Antisocial behaviour can be more subjective, and I think it's fair that you highlight it. Resolved often means that the service has done what the legal situation permits the service to do. Sometimes, however, we do not have the capacity to take the action that a complainant will require against an alleged perpetrator. For many cases, for us to take action against an alleged perpetrator, we require evidence and we're required to go through a legal process. So, for example, it's a misnotion that councils evict people for antisocial behaviour. We go to the court and ask the sheriff to evict the person. In order to do that, we need to gather evidence. It can be sometimes difficult to substantiate an allegation, especially if it's one person's word against another. So we are not always able to resolve a situation to the satisfaction of the complainant. We are able to address the situation as far as the legislation and the evidence permits, which does sometimes, as you say, leave an element of discontent. That, however, is applicable to all social landlords. It's not just restricted to ourselves. We do have tenancy enforcement officers. We also use the community wardens. So sometimes we try, and we have good relationships with the police. So we try and obtain independent sources of information to help verify what the complainant is telling us. And we also provide as much support to complainants in order to try and navigate them through the process. But there are circumstances where a complainant can have a desire that we take an action that legally we aren't able to do. Hopefully that contextualizes the question.
Thank you for that answer, Phil, and I can empathise completely with it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. If there are no further comments then, colleagues, I'll be happy. The recommendations in the paper are to note our performance report against the SSHC indicators and measures and how we compare against both the 2019-20 performance and the average for the housing sector. Note the proposed action plan to further strengthen our compliance against the regulatory framework and SSHC, and approve the AAS 2021, which has been prepared taking into account the outcomes of housing services self-evaluation of our performance. Are we happy with those recommendations, Polly? Thank you. Moving on, colleagues, the next item on the agenda is the Strategic Housing Investment Plan. And again, Phil, I assume that's over to you again.
Like the last paper, this is a report that comes to Cabinet each year. And like the last paper, it can be quite complicated. In fact, it can be very complicated. And on rereading the report yesterday, I think I will change its format for next year to make it simpler. Simply put, each year the local authority funding to subsidise the building of affordable homes, both low-cost home ownership and houses for social rent. The amount of funding they give us is called an RPA, a resource planning application, and that is detailed at paragraph 6, and I'll come to that in a moment. Once they have this funding, local authorities need to determine how they spend it. The document that details how they propose to spend it is called the SHIP, the Strategic Housing Investment Plan. The SHIP details what houses will be built, at what location, and if available, who the proposed landlord will be. Members should note that affordable housing includes houses for social rent, mid-market rent, and also low-cost home ownership. Some of the funding is used by councils to build council houses. Some of the funding is given to housing associations for them to build houses, and some is used to subsidise low-cost home ownership or mid-market rent. You will see at paragraph 6, our resource planning allocation for the next 5 years is just over £37 million, and our allocation for next year for 22-23 is £7.246 million. I do wish to note that the funding does not cover in full the cost of building new houses. So if, for example, it costs £140,000 to build a house, we don't receive £140,000. Previously, local authorities were awarded a flat rate subsidy of £57,000 per house, and housing associations were awarded a subsidy of approximately £70,000 per house. And both local authorities and housing associations could obtain an additional £2,000 per unit if those homes were built to a greener standard. Local authorities have been lobbying the Scottish Government for a number of years on the basis that the disparity between subsidy levels between housing associations and local authorities was perceived to be unfair. As such, those subsidy levels are under review, and the Scottish Government are now proposing that the minimum benchmark subsidy for councils will be £71,500 and housing associations will receive a minimum subsidy of £78,000. So whilst on the one hand that increase in subsidy is welcomed, and whilst the decrease in disparity is also welcomed, I do note that disparity still exists and local authorities are still lobbying the Scottish Government to eliminate that disparity. In relation to the report itself at paragraph 11, the SHIP notes that the tables are attached to Appendix 1. We are prioritising the delivery of social rented homes, including council new builds. We wish to have a range of affordable housing to meet a range of needs, including smaller homes and family homes and those suitable for the elderly. We are looking at 522 units of new affordable housing based in the next 5 years. We're also expecting a number of properties for sale, but that is not included in the figure of 522. About 10% of these new units are expected to be suitable for particular needs, such as wheelchair users, older people, etc. One thing I would note is that to meet the needs of housing in East Renfrewshire, we need to focus much of our building on the eastward side of the authority. Members will remember what I said for the last report, whereby the bulk of our stock at the moment is in the Leven Valley, the bulk of our demand is on the eastward side. So we need to build primarily on the eastward side of the council area. However, the availability of land means this isn't always possible, so we also need to consider developments in the Leven Valley as well. I would note that if we own the land, we can control to a greater extent when we build. However, some of our council housing new build is a percentage of a private development. What I mean by that is if a private developer is going to build 100 houses, and 25% of those houses will be bought by the council under the council's affordable housing policy, those 25 houses would then become a council house. However, in that scenario, these houses will be built when it suits the private developer and not when it suits the council. So as a consequence, there's always an element of risk in the delivery timescales because we cannot control when we go on site. That can be down to the private developer. And even when we do own the land, there can be delays as we consider things such as road access, parking, and dealing with asbestos and contamination, etc. I am happy to speak to members about the content of the report with this meeting, as I know it is complicated, but hopefully that summarised the content of the report. I'm happy to recommend this report to Cabinet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. I know it is often a complicated report and there is a number of difficulties with it, and you've highlighted a couple of those, particularly the land ownership issues, which have obviously been a headache for us well, since East Renfrewshire came into being. I don't doubt it's been a particular issue and continues to be so. But I do welcome the increased number of social housing units that we have, and I think that's to be welcomed by everyone. I think we've been arguing for some time about the need for additional social housing, and it's good to see that we are actually in a position where we are not only building council houses again, but increasing the numbers that we had hoped to build, and that's a good sign going forward. It's also welcome to note that the disparity between social housing landlords is diminishing, and that the funding therefore is better than it was previously, and again that certainly helps in our case for building more houses. Happy to open it up, colleagues, for any comments. Nope. On that basis then, colleagues, thanks very much for the report, Phil, and I'd be happy to note approve the East Renfrewshire Strategic Housing Investment Plan for 2022-23 to 2026-27 for submission to the Scottish Government. Okay, thanks very much, colleagues. That concludes our business for this morning. Thank you very much to everyone for your attendance and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.